allegations then of a chemical weapons attack. What is the UN going to do to get to the bottom of this?
Well, as you heard, every right-minded person in the world condemns this absolutely and utterly. And as the Special Envoy for Syria has just been saying, there will be a proper and due process of investigation. It needs to be done absolutely comprehensively and urgently. And the UN is putting in place the necessary work to make sure that that happens. And we need to identify precisely what happened. And if it indeed was some form of chemical attack, who perpetrated it, and indeed then make sure that the full accountability and exposure of that is put forward, and that the people who are responsible are held to account and duly arraigned and punished.
How can the UN hold these people to account? Clearly, some kind of war crimes procedure could begin, but some people may be watching this and thinking that in many ways the UN is kind of powerless.
Well, international law has its own rules and abilities to ensure that there are both sanctions and penalties, and it's that due process which we have to cleave onto, and that's precisely why due process is so important. When you have people who are committing crimes, whether they're national or international, whether they are in war or not in war, certainly war has rules, and we need to make sure that they are applied. But the whole point is that there are penalties for those who transgress, and that needs, of course, a due process to get to that point, but they must be applied. And I think you will have heard anybody from the UN, me included, that whilst I focus particularly on meeting humanitarian needs and the protection of civilians, particularly as it comes out of conflict, but also whenever there are natural disasters and emergencies and relief is required, it's absolutely vital that at all times we are in conformity with international humanitarian law.
Indeed, the procedure must be followed, and that is extremely important. Mr. O'Brien, if you bear with us for a second, we'll be coming back to you in just a few moments. The United Nations said it was talking to Russia about a workable humanitarian pause in fighting in Aleppo. The first pause was upheld this Thursday to allow supplies and medical access. But the UN says 3 hours a day, as is being proposed, is not enough to help up to 2 million civilians trapped in the divided Syrian city. The UN wants a 48-hour weekly halt to the violence in order to deliver large amounts of food and other aid to, and to evacuate the sick and wounded.
The Russian delegation confirmed their willingness to sit down with us to try to agree on a workable humanitarian pause. 3 hours is indeed not enough. 3 hours is really nothing. We need 48 hours.
Let's get more from Stephen O'Brien, the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, on this issue. 48 hours. Some people, again, watching might think this can't get near the actual problems and the scale of the problems in Aleppo.
Well, try and put yourself in the position of being somebody who is very near or indeed in besiegement in Aleppo. Whether you're in eastern Aleppo, about 250,000 or more people, or in western Aleppo with 1.3 million people, controlled by different forces, where there is intense fighting and tension everywhere, where you have been living under this threat for 5 years, where it's been impossible for you to have any kind of hope for a future. And of course, you are suspicious, therefore, of everybody and everything. And the scale of this need of life-saving, of water, of electricity, of medical treatments, of any chance of a child going to school, all these things are missing. And even when there is food or there are things that you need just to support the basic needs of life, the prices in Aleppo of anybody who has anything are skyrocketing, so it puts it way out of reach of most people who've already been stripped of everything they've got, and you only have to look at the pictures to see the way that the buildings have been shattered, collapsing like packs of cards, and right down to the ground. So that's the terrible suffering and loss and condition of the people in Aleppo. The supply routes to try and get humanitarian life-saving aid in. If it's to the east, we needed the Castello Road. You'll have heard that that's been badly shelled and bombed, and that took the supplies from the 2 crossings we had from Turkey, supplying both UN and commercial vehicles who have been inspected under a proper verification mechanism to come all the way down along the Costello roads, and that could get into the eastern part of Aleppo. And then to get into the west, they're now coming up from the south, going around the east and then across the north and then back down into the west. We need two-way roads so that you can have lorries going in, whilst at the same time those which have been able to discharge their goods into a controlled environment where people are getting the food who need it. Therefore, you have to have a distribution mechanism that is fair and properly assessed. Then the empty vehicles are able to come out without all getting jammed with those going in. We're dealing with a population of humanitarian needs, which is more or less the size of Paris. And for those of you who are watching, who are French viewers, you will understand the scale of that is such that we need to have at least 48 hours every week in order to have sufficient number of lorries loaded with the foodstuffs and other materials going in, whilst at the same time those lorries which have unloaded are able to put on to them the evacuees, the ones who have injuries or chronic needs medically to get treated, and to get those out to a place of safety, but always of their choosing and voluntarily. And be clear, until we have guarantees of safety from all parties to the fight, not just one side, to all parties of the fight, then we cannot guarantee the safety of our aid workers, many of whom have lost lives over these 5 years. It's very brave, the work they do. And let's be clear how brave and courageous they are, whether they're international or national. But let's also be clear, they're not suicidal. That's why we have to insist on this sufficient level of humanitarian, free, safe, unimpeded access, where we can then deliver on the needs impartially, not just to one side, or partially in terms of only meeting a very mere fraction of the needs.
You've painted a very vivid picture, Mr. O'Brien, of the challenge there, and of course the suffering that the people of Aleppo continue to go through, and the risks that your aid workers face. It isn't just from collapsing buildings, unexploded ordnance, and as you point out, other parts of this very delicate equation of combatants in this conflict who may or may not decide to respect the terms of any truce. You can't guarantee anybody's safety. That's the bottom line, sadly, isn't it?
Well, of course, we have very great experience as the United Nations in getting humanitarian supplies into those who need it, whose lives need to be saved. And it is all our duty to make every effort right across the international community, and particularly through the United Nations and its humanitarian partners, to really pull on the expertise and the judgment and the skills of the people who know how to do this. But when we negotiate safe, unimpeded access, there is always some risk that somebody is going to breach whatever agreement has been put in place in order to get these incredible public and necessary goods to people. But you make a judgment according to the quality of the negotiation that you have, and how people who are in command and control of violent forces are able to ensure that they can silence the guns in order for the safe passage of these convoys. And wheeled convoys overland are always by far the best to be able to get the quantities through. Some people call for airdrops and air access. Of course, in absolute desperation and the final resort, that's always an option and one we would never rule out. But be very clear, it takes about, as we've seen elsewhere in Syria, in the supplies to Deir ez-Zor, it takes about well, it's been about 6 weeks of airdrops to deliver the amount that one normal-sized large wheeled convoy would deliver to the people. So you can see the enormity of the scale and the timing in order to reach people who have very urgent needs. And that's why we are so insistent on this land-routed roads of sufficient size and for sufficient time, so that we can reach the scale of need. As I say, something in the order of 2 million people are in Aleppo, of whom well over 1 million are in very urgent need of life-saving support, and they don't they're not all in one place. They're both in East and West Aleppo. So it's the entire city. And that's why, if you can imagine a city close to anybody who's watching this, how difficult this is and why it's so necessary to insist on something way beyond 3 hours, and 48 hours is a good minimum, and weekly. And that would give us a real chance to reach all the people in need.